Right, so thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Members of the Gus panel for calling me up here. Most of Gus House, it's really an honor to be here in Nat's quarterfinals. I never thought that I would ever make it here. Friends on side off, I'm so honored to be hitting these guys in their last ever after round. I hope that you guys enjoy it as well. And of course, Taubes, for being a true friend and great partner, I know that you guys are going to enjoy this case. So currently, when police have somebody in an interrogation situation, that is when they're in custody and they're interrogating them, they're allowed to use what are called ruses. That is, they're allowed to lie to them, say that, we have somebody in another room who's willing to testify against you, or we have DNA evidence against you, or something like that, when they're not actually able to do that, when they don't actually have this evidence. And we're going to say very simply, police should not be allowed to lie to interrogation suspects, that they should make a good faith effort to always tell the truth. Guilty?
Yeah.
Splendid. We've got three reasons why we think that this is a great policy to turn to. The first thing that we want to talk about is how it violates constitutional rights. We've got 4 constitutional challenges that we want to talk about in this round. The first thing we want to talk about is self-incrimination. So it's true that, when you're taken in, when you're held in police custody, you're read your Miranda rights. It's true that these people know what their rights are. But it's impossible to give voluntary consent without correct information. That is, we would question how meaningful rights are if you don't actually know when you ought to be using them, or what the situation is in which those rights are actually useful. So to give an example, like if I gave somebody a computer who had never used a computer before, but didn't tell them how to use the computer, and said, oh, by the way, if you use it incorrectly once, the computer becomes worthless to you. It's like some gift, right? You have to also let people know how they're going to be able to use these rights, when they're going to be able to use these rights, and how to make them most effective for them. We think that the rights become ultimately meaningless if you don't give them a mechanism by which they can gauge when they should be using those rights. So things like self-incrimination and the kinds of confessions that would be coming out of this aren't really, we believe, protected under the spirit of the Fifth Amendment. The second thing that we would talk about, though, is illegal seizure. So in order for somebody to be legally arrested, there must be good reason for doing so. We would say that not informing somebody of the circumstances of their seizure takes away from their ability to properly act. So we think that properly acting in this situation is not just stuff like, pleading the Fifth and not talking, right? It's stuff like knowing whether you ought to be calling your lawyer, knowing whether you ought to be saying certain things versus other things based on the evidence that they have, based on what they know, based on, how you believe you can best mount the defense, given that whatever you say in the interrogation room is going to be admissible in court. We think that, again, sort of like, the first subpoint under this, that if you don't know how you should be doing these things, it's impossible to be making correct decisions. So essentially, you're just going blind here, right? It's impossible to know what the reality outside the interrogation room is. We think that the police have a responsibility to at least inform you of what the reality outside the interrogation room is. That is, we believe that people inside the interrogation room, if you believe that they have the right to Miranda rights at all, we want them to do this because we believe that they ought to have the ability to properly act. So if we take away from their ability to properly act, then obviously Miranda rights become basically worthless. The third thing that we want to say under this, though, is fair trial. So obviously, as I said, the things said by the accused can be used as evidence. And we sort of point to the fruit of the poisonous tree. That is, it applies when things that the police do, that they do it illegally. We think that this should also apply to things that the police clearly do in bad faith in situations like this. The Supreme Court, for example, recently implied that the good or bad faith of the officer that should determine evidentiary exclusion, like Herring v. U.S. and situations like that, right? We think that when you have situations like this, where the good faith of the officer is what's in question here, that is deterring officers from doing these bad things, then the utmost, the thing that we should be using to make our decisions in determining, police action is whether or not it's a deterrent on police bad faith. We think that this is a deterrent on police bad faith, and it protects the individuals in the interrogation room from giving coerced confessions. The fourth and final thing we want to talk about from the standpoint, though, is that it's basically akin to torture. That is, it's basically cruel and unusual. So why is it that we don't allow things that, under penalty of torture or, while people are being tortured? Well, we believe this is inherently coercive because, we're violating their integrity. So we'd ask for a distinction about violating bodily integrity versus violating psychological integrity. That is, we would say that doing something like this, that is, putting undue information in somebody's head in order to intimidate them with things that they ought to know are not true, basically violates their psychological integrity to the point where, it's no different if they think that they're going to be drowned by waterboarding if they don't answer a question. Similarly, if they think that they're going to be going to jail for 40 years if they don't answer a question because there's somebody who's going to testify against them. It's the same kind of, rationale we use in not allowing information derived from torture in penalties.
Are you ever an undercover sting operation?
Right. The thing about undercover sting operations is you need a warrant for these things, and you actually need rationale behind them. We actually think that there are, huge differences. But moreover, once somebody's actually in police custody, the rules change, right? That's why you don't have to read somebody their ransom. In a police custody. So obviously there's a different set of rights. So the second independent point we want to talk about is fairness. So we believe in having a system where powers and abilities are balanced between the police and the accused. And it's sort of, an adversarial system versus an inquisitorial system. this creates three particular imbalances. First, there's no countervailing power to lie. So the police have the ability to validate or invalidate the claims of the accused. The accused has no such power. So even if the accused decides that they're going to lie back to the police, or if they're going to try to sort of counterbalance the police ability to lie, the police can go out and be like, does this information check out? And the police can determine whether it does. We think that in instances where something is true, that's okay, because the police aren't lying, so they should be able to count on the other person to countervail with the truth. But if the police are lying, then we believe that in a system where rights and powers are balanced, then we should expect that the accused ought to have a countervailing power to lie, but there's obviously no way for them to do that. Second evidence, though, is that it allows the police to act rationally and slowly, while forcing the accused to act emotionally and hastily. Now, we think that in the case where there's actually due reason for the accused to act emotionally and hastily, that is, if there's really a reason why it is in their best interest to do so, then that's the right that we ought to impose on them. But we think that if it's not in their best interest, then having the police be able to control the situation completely while not having the other person know anything about what's going on is inherently wrong in this case. But the third and final thing on fairness is that it disproportionately targets innocence. That is, we would say that situations where somebody is actually guilty are situations in which there's a much higher probability that they will actually have evidence. That is, they won't have to lie. But situations in which they're going to not have evidence, they're going to need to lie, are disproportionately going to be cases where the person hasn't actually done anything. That is, where the police suspect that they've done something and want to accuse them of having done something, but they haven't been able to actually uncover any evidence. And in these cases, the innocent are still going to be, prone to, confessing, right? Because they think that, somebody else is going to, testify against me, and there will be, an incorrect decision in trial, and I'll be put in court, or I'll be put in jail, even though I didn't do anything. They'll still be intimidated into giving something like a confession, even though they didn't actually do it. The third and final thing I want to talk about very quickly is that it encourages more illegal arrests. So it allows police to arrest based on mere suspicion, that badger the accused person is making a confession. That is, they can claim that they are validating something they already know, when in fact they're learning it for the first time. And the only people who will be aware of it are the police. This actually creates a real loophole in the system wherein there is an incentive for police to break these rules. Obviously, if they get caught, the same disincentive exists, but it now makes them easier to not get caught because they can lie to people in this way. The second thing, though, is that things said by accused can lead to other arrests. So it sort of flows in the same, fruit of the poisonous tree, right? So the confessions that come out of these, what we would call coerced and bad faith interrogations can then lead to supposedly legitimate arrests of other people. But obviously we don't think that other people should be arrested if things are said in bad faith in an interrogation room for the same reason that we have things like the exclusionary rule. Final thing that we sort of ask is, on the whole, why is this bad? Well, it'll lead to more innocent people being arrested as well. That is, we believe that the reason why we have these police rules in the first place is universalization of law. That is, should innocent people be afforded the same kind of protection as guilty people? So even if you believe that a lot of people in these instances will be guilty, the question is, are innocent people due these particular rights? If you believe that they are due these rights, then we think that we should institute the for all Jews.
I thank the Prime Minister and invite the leader of the opposition to deliver any
It's too honored to be able to give this speech, especially partnering with Lauren, love of my life, 4 years base partner, and overall great person. They're also great, not as great as her. And I would be honored if Rocky actually adopted my story as my last speech. I'm going to try to make it as good as possible. And if you see fit to move me through everything else, you've got that power. I think. So there's 3 arguments I want to talk about. And the first thing I want to talk about is basically witness. The first 2 are examples of witness is useful. So I think actually this is an incredibly useful tool for the police. And the first example, or when you're talking about conspiracy. So it's recognized that police have an incentive to break up large criminal organizations in which there are conspiracies. Well, I have a very often abused term on assets called the prisoner's dilemma. And it's fun because in this round, it's actually a prisoner's dilemma. You actually create one by saying, the person next door is talking, you might want to speed up and catch up so you can cut a deal first. Recognize that all of these things, in order to break a conspiracy, means breaking a single individual. But on their side of the house, you can never set individuals against other individuals. You can never claim that someone else is talking to incentivize any individual to talk. I think the only way you actually break these sort of criminal conspiracies is to actually use these sort of breaches to maintain their own incentive to actually start speaking.
Is it another way to take 2 people from the conspiracy, actually set them against each other, and get them to confess that way?
Wait, yeah, you put them in the same room, they both look at each other, it's me and Andy, we go, you good? Yeah, we're good. All right, we're just for a while. Or I guess you put them in 2 separate rooms and go, Andy's in the other room, and I'm going, well, I know Andy's not talking because they didn't tell me he was talking, and if they can't lie to me, that must mean he's keeping silent. So there's no dilemma. Andy's not very confident. The second reason, I think actually the much better reason, is when this is often used is for exigent circumstances. recognize there are often times where normal methods of evidence collection just aren't enough to intervene in ongoing illegal activities. So, for example, if you have someone where a hostage is located, or a drug deal is going down, or arms are being transferred, you actually want to put an immense amount of pressure on them immediately in order to get the information to stop ongoing crimes. Recognize that when you say things like, I have DNA evidence against you, there's a probability that you might get it later, but you might not have time to do it now. And this method actually allows you to put enough pressure on individuals to stop ongoing crimes, just not crimes that happened in the past. So I think it's in the interest of public safety to allow these sort of things. But the third thing I want to talk about is Rocky's bizarre opinion of innocent people. Because what he claims on inside the house, and the only way this ever hurts innocent people, is if I'm sitting in a room, I may never, because I'm innocent, I was walking down the street, the cops took me and they go, you killed this girl. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about unless we have your DNA. And my immediate response is, well, I didn't kill her, but they have my DNA, so I'm going to sign a confession. That doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense why individuals would ever start confessing to things when they lie about evidence that isn't there. This can't hurt innocent people, because innocent people aren't afraid of non-existent things. I would probably be confused enough to call a lawyer, because it seems that something weird is going on, given that my DNA is somewhere that I wasn't. I'd probably get legal representation. Sure.
You're telling me that no one ever signs an unfair plea bargain because they're not afraid to go to court?
Okay. I think that yes, occasionally that can happen. It is more likely to happen when they are intimidated by the police in physical coercion. When they're afraid that they're going to use the overwhelming, like literally sitting in a room with a guy with a large gun is intimidating. What they're suggesting is that the lie of DNA is an additional reason why you would confess. And I don't think it is. Recognize that all of these people have been read their Miranda rights. All of these people know that they can have access to a lawyer. And I think all these people ought to exercise their access to a lawyer. And it's unreasonable to assume that people would, instead of asking for a lawyer to help with a plea bargain, would just immediately sign something put in front of them. And I don't think that that's reasonable. Going case side. The first argument they give us is about violating constitutional rights and give us 4 things about the Constitution that don't really relate to this. The first one they say is you have the right not to self-incriminate. But it isn't, we don't think that this is violated because the reason why we want the right not to self-incriminate is so that witnesses for the defense come forward. Recognize that if I witness a crime and I'm also committing a crime, I'm never going to come forward to the police to protect an innocent person, because if I'm put on the stand, I could be in and ask, what were you doing? And then I would have to convict myself. The reason why we protect this constitutional right is not to protect the defendant in the sense that we don't want the defendant incriminating themselves, but rather we want witnesses to come forward, so we don't think that that's particularly meaningful. They then say that this is an illegal seizure because you don't know what you're opting into. I actually don't think this is an illegal seizure before you can have the opportunity to say no, not talk, or get a lawyer. You aren't forcing it out of them. No, thank you. The next argument they give is that you need to be informed about reality. But against the innocent people who are informed about reality, they know that the evidence doesn't exist. And I actually don't think that cops are this abusive. I don't think that cops are really just pulling innocent people off the street and randomly throwing questions at them until they finally admit to something. I think generally speaking, when the cops do pull in people for questioning, they do have reasons to suspect them. In fact, you do have to have reasons to suspect them in order to detain someone. Sure.
But even if you don't believe that people are actually innocent, everybody they pull in is innocent until proven guilty. Are you willing to go against this constitutional principle as well?
No, like, that's not what we're arguing. We're just saying that innocent people aren't affected by this, right? Like, we're not harming the innocent people by suggesting it. The next thing they say is you have a right to a fair trial. Yes, if they win the rest of the case, they do have a right to a fair trial, and this seems to be that. But also I suggest that, actually, no, I don't have to see that argument right off the case, even though it is cross-applying the case. But there's another response to this. During the trial, it's going to come out that the evidence wasn't there. And look, if during the trial, literally the only thing they have on you is a signed confession, and then they go before the court and the jury and say, hey, look, we've got this signed confession, and you're like, well, you told me I had DNA evidence. Where's the DNA evidence? I signed this because you lied to me. Seems like most juries are going to be like, wait a second, there's only a conviction, there's no evidence, you said there was evidence, you intimidated them into making this, signing this confession. It seems like no jury would actually convict them. Especially if they look as pernicious as what they're suggesting actually happens, which I don't think actually happens in reality. They then say this is torture and compare it to waterboarding. Sweet! I love waterboarding and will defend it in any way possible. They say it's coercion because there's no difference between violating the psychological integrity of someone and the bodily integrity of someone. That's not true. One hurts a lot more than the other. But more importantly, we violate the psychological integrity of people all the time. Look at sting operations.
And you don't need a warrant to do a sting operation, by the way. That's what undercover police officers do. You don't get a warrant beforehand. So we allow people to walk in, pretend to be someone else, violate their psychological integrity by modifying their beliefs about the real world, and then get them to commit a crime, or they watch them commit a crime, and then arrest them for it. We're lying to them about the fact that we're undercover police officers. So it seems like we're able to psychologically torture by modifying people's opinions of reality. So I don't think that that's a particularly meaningful stance. Furthermore, I actually don't think it's very coercive at all at the point where the only effective measure comes from if there actually is evidence. The second thing they talk about, though, is the police. And what they say is that there's no countervailing claims that you can't lie back to the police. You're right, that you could not talk. You could get a lawyer and recognize that if they don't have evidence, they can only hold you for a limited amount of time, as well, like 24 hours. Then without proper evidence, they can only detain you for a set amount of period. So we also check the police in this, and that we don't allow them to just detain people indefinitely until they finally do convict, just to actually get to a trial. They then say that we should encourage people to act rationally, not emotionally. That's why we suggest that they get a lawyer when we actually arrest them. They then say that it targets innocence. It actually doesn't target innocence, because recognize if you walk up to someone and says, go and do we have DNA evidence that you've been there, we have this witness, and they respond with, that's weird because I wasn't there, it's probably a pretty good indication that they are innocent. If they aren't fazed by the actual evidence, I think the police are much more likely to let them go. The third argument is about illegal stuff. They say, oh wow. They say that they're more likely to break the rules, they're more likely to select innocent people off the street and just question them. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we see that in the status quo, and I don't think there are any particular extremist cases. This is an effective law enforcement technique. It doesn't hurt innocent people, and their constitutional arguments are confusing. We are proud to oppose.
Here, I think we are the opposition and invite the member of government to deliver any constructive errors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for calling me up here. Members of this voting us panel, voting us out, it is a true honor to be debating a national quarterfinals. Rocky for being my debate partner, sign off for a very spirited but ultimately misguided opposition to this case. And my first overview, I'd like to say that I think that on side opposition, there's a reason why they're confused by our constitutional argument. And the reason is because the opposition that they give is vastly inconsistent with the standards that you typically use to set a separation between the rights of the innocent and the rights of the accused in our democracy. Because what are the concessions that they make in our constitution? Ben says we are psychologically coercive all the time. And he says that, sting operations are really coercive. Well, if that's true, why do we have the Miranda warnings? Why do we say that there should be a lawyer with you when you're being interrogated? He says that, we have self-incrimination rules so that witnesses come forward. Then why can a defendant plead the fifth and to not self-incriminate? Why do they have that one? At that point, we would say, it's not enough for them to say that it's a useful tool that we could use in interrogation. It's not enough for them to say that we could gain some societal utility. They need to give us a standard as to when tools the police use, which have an impact on the innocent, which have an impact on coercion, should be used, and when we should balance it with the rights of the innocent. And that's what we didn't get out of them, and they're vastly inconsistent in the standards that we use, and that's why we think that we're going to win this round. So the first thing that he says is that this is useful, and he gives two examples of when it's useful. And the basic overview going into this argument is that he doesn't balance it against the rights of the accused and what rights they have. And what we tell you is that there are a number of reasons why you should balance in favor of the accused in this instance. The first is because it involves prima facie rights. Rights that people have under the status quo, which we say they can only access if they have this right. That is, the right to have a lawyer, the right not to self-incriminate. What Rocky tells you, and they never respond to, is that if you don't know the circumstances of the situation, you have no ability to access those rights, because you don't know whether it's appropriate to use them or not. But if you don't know whether it's appropriate to use them or not, you don't have those rights at all. The rights are premised on the idea that rational actors should be protected. But without information, those rational acts cannot exist. We see this kind of principle all the time with notifying people of their rights when they're arrested. This is a situation where there's even more coercion because they're in the interrogation room, because they have this sort of asymmetry of power. We say that the asymmetry of information then should be lowered in this circumstance. But there's another reason why we should put the balance on the side of rights in this instance. Because this disproportionately targets the innocent. All the examples they give, if they have evidence against these people, they can use that evidence to make credible, real threats against them. But if they don't have that evidence in their lives, that means that they're disproportionately going to be targeting people who they don't have evidence against. And people aren't guilty until proven innocent. They're innocent until proven guilty, and that requires evidence. That's the examples that they give, because they're not realistic. The first thing that they talk about is conspiracy. They say that oftentimes you have lots of people, and prisoner's dilemmas are great. So what we say is, have a prisoner's dilemma, have
two people interrogating, and like, you know, the existence of two people creates that prisoner's dilemma. Well, they're like, well, you'll have to tell them everything that they say. What we say to you is like, first of all, the significance is not like if you tell them everything they say. The significance is that if you lie that there's even a person there, first of all, that's bad because it disproportionately targets innocence, as we said, because those are situations where there might not even be a conspirator in these sorts of circumstances, right? But, or this person might not be a conspirator. But furthermore, like, what we say is do a good faith effort to like give people information about what's going on. If they know that someone's being interrogated, like, they can draw assumptions from that. You don't have to lie to them to create this prisoner's dilemma. All you have to do is set up a situation which is true, that there is someone else who's actually had this sort of information, that someone else has evidence out there. So we are asking them questions that they haven't intended to turn you in, because after all, they are self-interested. That doesn't mean you have to lie to them. That actual situation, that's where the prisoner's dilemma actually started from, right? Because otherwise, you know, so the next thing is the ticking time bomb situation, right? So sort of, if there's a crime going on. Now, it seems to be rather contrived. We know that a crime is going on. We know that this person knows about this crime. But we don't have any evidence that our lie is and since we know that you did this crime, if you don't tell us, your penalties are going to be severely increased if you don't cooperate with us, right? But furthermore, what we would say is our rule doesn't go against the sort of like, there's an atomic bomb in New York City example, right? Because what matters there is that that actually is a true example. If you think of this as a possible hypothetical scenario. Our situation doesn't prevent you from saving the world. It's just that you can't use what you get admissible as evidence, right? Like we say that if you get some sort of thing, like if you really need to get the bomb, like the priority is not that you are able to use what he says when you lie to them as evidence. The priority is like to get the bomb. It's a completely different scenario. But the next thing they say is that no one would confess if they didn't actually commit the crime, right? Because if, after all, the police say we have evidence, and people are like, well, I didn't do it, they'll have no problem. They'll just be like, no, I didn't commit the crime. There's no way that I'm going to possibly confess this. False confessions never, ever happen. So a couple of problems here. What they use to say, like, if you know that there's absolutely no evidence of the crime scene about you, is an extreme example. There are plenty of instances in which you know that you were in the area, that there might be circumstantial evidence against you, that if you were brought to court, there would be a possibility that you could be convicted. And the police are now notifying you that if you get convicted, oh, you'll go to jail for life. But if you sign this plea bargain, which means that there won't be a trial, which means that you won't be able to say, hey, where's that evidence? It means that you won't be able to challenge whether you're guilty. Where people's liberty is lost despite being innocent because only circumstantial evidence exists, but the police are able to lie and say they found more than they actually have. That's why this disproportionately targets innocence, and that's why this is a standard which should not be had. So let's go case time. Let's look at the things that they talk about, that they don't really respond to. So the first thing that we talk about is this idea of constitutional rights. And they say this doesn't make a lot of sense. And they say, so self-incrimination. They say, the reason why we have self-incrimination is because we want witnesses to come forward and not to fear that they'll have to incriminate themselves in the stand. Well, maybe that's the reason why we have self-incrimination for witnesses, but what they have to justify is why we have self-incrimination for defendants. Why we say that people shouldn't be asked to and there are plenty of reasons why we believe that. Because we believe that that kind of psychological coercion is wrong. Because we believe that the state should have to assemble a case against the defendant, and not the state should be inquisitorial and force the case out of the person. But furthermore, what we would say is that, like, why, if this were true, if these defendants didn't have these sort of rights, then why would we give them lawyers? Why would we say to them that they have the right to remain silent when we arrest them? This is a more coercive situation. It seems inconsistent that we wouldn't allow it in this case. But then the next thing they say is that they're not forcing this information out because, you know, if they didn't do it, they wouldn't say it. I think I already dealt with it. But then they say, you know, they say that that a lot of these people aren't innocent. Listen, it doesn't matter if a lot of these people aren't innocent. It's disproportionately what you're targeting is innocence. But it doesn't even need to be disproportionate. If innocents are implicated here, we have much greater value in this country, the right to the innocent, than the possibility of getting more guilty people in jail. They need to do that and balance that in their speeches. But the next thing that they say is that, like, they say that during the trial you can, like, ask where's the evidence. This doesn't apply in the cases of plea bargains. But furthermore, this also doesn't apply if you're not able to fully challenge these sorts of things because you've given them other evidence, which is the reason why police use this all the time. It's a really powerful tool. They can use in one case, they can get more information, and then use it in other cases, even if they don't implicate you with that. Now it incentivizes them to use it all the time because it's a profitable tool. That's why we have the exclusionary rule. If we allow evidence to be used in court, the police would never have an incentive not to use it, even against innocent people who are violating their integrity, putting them in coercive situations, even though they didn't do anything wrong, because they can get other people guilty to jail. We don't think using people as a means to an end like that is something that we
allow in a democracy. But secondly, we talked about having a fair trial and how we wanted to deter this kind of bad faith. This is an argument that they don't deal with. They just say it doesn't happen. We think that constitutional protections are matters of principle. They can't assert it doesn't happen to justify why these protections shouldn't exist. They exist in case it does happen to protect against them. But the next thing they say is that, it's torture. They're like, cool, torture. We allow torture all the time. We allow people to be psychologically coercive. No, we don't. That's why we have the Miranda warning, which says you should have a lawyer, that you should know what's going on. We think this is a logical extension of that law.
Do we force people to have awareness in the room with them?
No, because if people are able to rationally make the decision not to, then they have the choice of whether to rationally make the choice of yes or no is why they should be informed of their circumstances. So unless we're going to come here and counter case in the MO that we should force them to have a lawyer, which would be a protection, which is not really their advocacy, then they don't want to have it for themselves. So that's a lot of our arguments. We're very proud of this one.
Here, I thank that speaker and invite the member of opposition, Warren Bateman, to deliver the final construction piece of the round.
Oh man, thanks so much everyone. I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's a big honor. Thank you so much to Ben, all of our novices. I'm just feeling happy about everything. But that being said, end the nice boring portion of the round, because Thomas's overview is just like a shittier, shorter version of the rest of the round. He tells me that off is inconsistent with standard views constitutionally. That is flatly untrue. We know this is the case because ruses are allowed now, so it's probably not unconstitutional at the point where the ACLU hasn't brought it to court. But even then, Ben weighs the utility of this test versus checks against abuse. So if there are checks against abuse, and this is a utile tool, then probably we should still be able to have this tool. And finally, we say that if this tactic is not available for police to use, what is the rational outcome? Police will just use other worse tactics. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is they will just detain people indefinitely because these people are suspects for crimes, but they can't actually talk to them because they don't have complete information. So as a result, they'll just throw someone in jail and wait till you do have complete information, and then you can talk to them. But what's the problem with this? There's no timeline for evidence acquisition. So at that point, you have a constitutional vaccine for police to detain people indefinitely. So the next thing he says is look, you don't know if your rights exist at all, so that's not a meaningful right, right? Okay, look, Miranda still exists, so not only do you know your rights still exist, you are exclusively apprised of the fact that your rights still exist. But moreover, we think that it's just true that if people rationally choose not to exercise these rights, if people decide that they want to talk to the police, then fine, they should be able to talk to the police. If they think that that will get them off, sure.
Okay, it says okay to allow people to use these rights if they're deciding whether to use them rationally. Can you explain to me why people can make a rational calculus if they have no idea what the circumstances surrounding their detention are?
So let's just talk about it now, because this is the philosophy they consistently talk about throughout the round, that people have to have full access to information. The problem, of course, with this philosophy is that it requires police to tell people everything about the crime that's going on. This is a crazy, crazy high burden to put on police officers. So why is this problematic? It's basically Freedom of Information Act requests that, people that are detained can ask a police officer, no matter what. Not only do you have to know, everything about, your particular involvement, but you have to know everything about the crime in which you might be implicated. Literally everything. You have to be fully apprised of everything that the police know in order to have that complete information that you're talking about. No, thank you. So the next thing that we say is, okay, so look, Ben gives you a couple of examples of where this might be useful. Take, for example, conspiracies. This is the literal prisoner's dilemma, and oftentimes with conspiracies, this is the only way to actually get people to testify. We don't actually really get a response to this. They say, well, this disproportionately targets innocents. Okay, last round in my PMR, I asked a question to the panel, and that was, ladies and gentlemen, how do people work? Because I don't think people work by saying, I'm fully innocent of this crime, I might as well confess. They try to give you some analysis about maybe it would be easier for people to avoid the court process. Sometimes people can't afford lawyers. Luckily, we have a public defense system. There seems to be checks against the abuse that they talk about, and Thomas, by his own admission, says this is a hugely effective tactic. So if we're worried about protecting our citizenry, no thank you, then certainly we would want this tactic to be in place. But in fact, I can say moreover on Judge Ben's point that there's a huge incentive for people to collude, because Ben tells you, and you never get a response to this really brilliant point, that you know that the other individual is not talking by omission. Because if the police have to inform you of everything about the crime, then you know that if the police don't explicitly tell you that the other person is talking, talking. So you can't ever prosecute conspiracies under this language. So the next thing that they talk about is that there are time constraints for ongoing crimes. Their thought to get to this is like, well, certainly there are some evidence, right? That's not the point. The point here is that when you have someone in a psychological state of confession, when people have already, confessed, they're likely to reveal explicit details. At that point, we think that, using a tactic to get people to confess if they are, in fact, guilty of the crime is good because it expedites the process of acquiring additional details that might actually benefit the citizenry. Literally, if we can accrue any benefit from this tactic while still showing that there are constitutional checks in place to ensure that individuals aren't actually coerced, then that seems like a reasonable tactic to use. The next thing that they talk about is innocent people don't confess to things. The response we get to this is there are instances when people weigh the probability of their conviction versus anything else. But again, these people know that they're innocent. Miranda exists. People know they don't have to talk. And if they know they don't have money, we give them a lawyer. They haven't given you any example in which this coercion would actually lead to someone being wrongly convicted. I think that's a problem for their side of the house. Moving case studies great. The first thing they talk about is violates constitutional rights. They give you a bunch of really, really bizarre standards, but ultimately I think it defaults to what Taubes says in his last speech, and that's just psychologically coercing people is wrong. This is a bizarre standard because it's not in the Constitution, and also it is always coercive to interrogate people. Anytime you have a police officer and an innocent person in a room, who has the gun and who has the authority of the law? The police officer. That is always coercive, and we allow a degree of coercion in interrogations because that is effective. That's what keeps people actually confessing of things that they're guilty of. Sure.
The word torture isn't in the Constitution either. How do you distinguish between this kind of coercion and torture?
All right, so torture leads to art, I guess, but also, we do allow psychological coercion constitutionally, right? We can detain terrorists and keep them, for a long time and ask them, a lot of questions and, make them uncomfortable. We can't, lose them, but yes, there is an explicit difference between certain things. But as I told you earlier, this also puts a crazy high burden on police. They can't even ask the preliminary questions of an individual to ascertain whether or not they can be a suspect. This is problematic, right? They can't even determine whether or not an individual should be in the interrogation room without apprising them of all elements of these possible crimes that they might be guilty of. So literally all of their case is contingent upon the idea that you need complete information to assess your ability to talk to the police. But what happens in circumstances when the police don't have access to that complete information? So do the police have to, if they know, maybe 75% of what's going on, do they have to tell an individual, 75% of what's going on? What if that actually does change the individual decision calculus in a way that would be irrational for that individual? So it seems as though, allowing, incomplete access to information when information is often incomplete in reality is not actually any benefit on their side of the house. But also, I don't think that there's any right to this information. They tell you, there's self-incrimination, illegal seizure, fair trial. They had to prove to you that these rights are extant constitutionally, and I certainly don't think that they have. But we also tell you that, look, if it's hugely effective in terms of stopping crime, then the harms that they point to, the explicit things that they tell you, we can give you, for everything they tell you, an explicit check against those harms occurring, and at that point, I think we're definitely winning any constitutional analysis. Taubes doesn't get to the last 2 points. The first thing we talk about fairness. Ben says, look, you don't have to talk, you can get a lawyer, innocents aren't faced by, the rude sort of situations. And the final thing is that it encourages more illegal arrests. I just don't think that this is true. I think, police officers have oftentimes reasons to suspect individuals, and at that point, I don't think that you have police officers just, finding someone off the street and bringing them in and saying, I have evidence to convict you of rape. And I certainly don't think that, random guy off the street would be if the police officer says he has DNA evidence, I'm going to confess. I don't think that's how people work, and I don't think it's reasonable to assume that's how people work to completely change the system by which we adjudicate criminal law or passive code.
I step here and invite the leader of the to come and deliver his truth and instructive speech to the round, reminding him the usual caveats apply and about how
I'm going to start by clearing the confusion. Whether or not we're torturing people, I didn't think I was going to have to do this. We're not hurting them. We might be psychologically coercing them in the sense that we're asking them questions. Yeah. So it's also coercive. Asking a question, did you commit murder? You're going to jail if you don't tell us. You're going to jail if you don't come clean right now. That seems pretty coercive, right? That seems like using the overwhelming power of the state to ask questions about whether or not a crime occurred. Coercion. Sometimes coercion is okay. What they had to prove was this was so detrimental that no rational person could overcome this coercion. Everything's coercive in life. If you're a rational actor, you're coerced by good things and weighing arguments. That's what we're going to do. So the first question is, do I need all of the information in the world not to be retarded? Because on their side of the house, their side only works if they at any point go, maybe I shouldn't get a lawyer. I get arrested, I have no idea why. All right, maybe I'm just going to answer the questions and then talk to them. I'm innocent, fine. They then say, we've got DNA evidence. I'm like, circumstantial evidence is really weird. I don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden, they shove a plea bargain in front of me. If at all 3 points I go, I'm not going to get a lawyer. I'm not going to ask to see the evidence. I'm not going to actually ask for any of my rights. Yeah, at that point, I think ultimately you're going to be lost on our side of the house. But you have to buy that a lot of people are going to do this. Recognize that we don't compel people to have lawyers. On their side of the house, what they're actually suggesting is that you should have a lawyer present at every step of the way. That it should be required to have a lawyer to protect yourself because you're going to be emotional and irrational. But we don't think that that's the case. We think the vast majority, in fact, almost everyone is going to correctly identify, well, either they're lying to me and I'm just going to inform them that, you are lying, or I'm going to ask for a lawyer and we get all the procedural protections. Here's the worst part. If you buy their constitutional arguments are weird. All of them, all 4 of them. But if you buy them, the only way they have any merit whatsoever is if you buy that you need complete access to all information to make a rational decision. Recognize that any time you restrict access to information, because the overwhelming power of the state is involved, it's coercive and damaging to your constitutional rights, and that you might self-incriminate, you might have a legal search and seizure. All of these things only work if you require access to all information. But that's absurd. You obviously should be informing your suspect of what evidence you have, who you're interviewing, how it's going on. But that's the philosophy that lives on their side of the house. They're so desperate to protect innocence that they're willing to cripple the police force in the most absurd ways. The second thing I want to talk about there is innocence. And do we target them? Do we just randomly pull innocents off the street and start throwing evidence at the weak doctor and going, confess to something? No, it doesn't happen. It isn't a problem in the status quo. But even if it was, there's procedural checks and balances. So, for example, they can go to court. They say, well, if they have circumstantial evidence and you're petrified to go to court, we'll get a lawyer, and the lawyer can challenge that circumstantial evidence. They tell you have access to a lawyer. But even that's not even good, because circumstantial evidence still exists on their side of the house, so it seems like the state's always coercive and ever offering plea bargains that they should never do. And like all the harder things talked about, matter if they aren't lying, because circumstantial evidence still exists. Like, this is an argument having a justice system, because occasionally innocents will go to jail. We don't think significantly more are going on our side of the house. And then we say, they're still going to abuse the hell out of people. They're just going to detain them for 24 hours and just keep constantly asking the same question over and over again, right? That's not a ruse. That's probably pretty bad, too. So I think if the police are going to be retarded on our side of the house, they're also going to be retarded on their side of the house. But I want to put that idea of practicality. They're right. I didn't weigh in the LOC rights versus benefits because this is the weighing speech in the round. When I talk about innocence, I'm talking about an extraordinarily marginal amount, if any, impact on them, but there's a lot of benefits to crime. Just getting people to confess to crimes means you get more justice, you get victim closure, you break conspiracies. Yes, in order to break a conspiracy, it is useful to say the other person is talking to incentivize them talking. If they don't tell you that, everyone's gold in the conspiracy and we know it. See me and Andy and all of our conspiracies. Then they mock the ticking time bomb. And they say, this is stupid. Ticking time bombs don't exist. Well, we have a name for them. Exigent circumstances, right? Occasionally they do exist. And we think those are extraordinarily important. So, for example, you happen to catch someone who's smuggling illegal immigrants across the border, and you know there's a shipping container full of illegal immigrants sitting somewhere, and they're probably starving to death. Probably a time to use this sort of tactic. We're proud of them.
Right, so thank you once again, everybody. I have 3 questions to ask you as we adjudicate this round. The first thing I want to ask you is, why do we have Miranda in the first place? Because I think this is a question that we asked, that they never actually decided to tackle. So why do we have Miranda? so people know how to act appropriately and rationally. That's why we have it. It's not just so that people know what their rights are. It's not just something that we say in order to limit police liability. We say it, the spirit of us saying it is so that people aren't clueless when they're in police custody. It's so that they actually know how they should act to give themselves the best possibility of defense should they actually be arraigned. Now, they never actually give us any kind of a competing philosophy on their side of the house. And we give you examples of how it just doesn't make any sense to give people a right without explaining what it is, right? Suppose somebody drops you into a Kafka-esque maze and says, I give you the right to use the Dougal doll. Goodbye. It could be a great right, but if you have no idea what it is, then it's a meaningless right. Similarly, this might not be quite as extreme, like you know what the rights are. But if you don't know how to use the rights, then similarly, just knowing what they are is not enough. But then their philosophy sort of shifts in the MO. They say, if you do this, you'll have to tell people everything about the investigation. Well, no, I think that there can be a standard, right? First of all, we talk about good faith. Obviously, police have no obligation to make you more rational, just an obligation not to take away the rationality. Make a good faith effort to tell you everything relevant about the investigation that they would tell, for example, a person on the street or a reporter is something that we would think is okay. Another standard that we could use is the same standard that we use when furnishing evidence to the defense, discovery, for example. Like, that kind of evidence is evidence that we're finding furnishing to these people and these kinds of things, not evidence that would be furnishable in discovery. But they say, but we don't compel people to have lawyers. So obviously people are not compelled to act rationally in all circumstances. No, we think people can act rationally without a lawyer. That is, if they want to get a lawyer, they have a sort of additional level of rationality insofar as they have a legal professional there. The point is, we want them to be able to make a rational decision about whether or not they want to have a lawyer present. That is, the police should not be able to tell them, look, you can call your lawyer, but in 5 minutes this guy's going to confess, so it doesn't really mean anything. That hinders your ability to actually meaningfully decide whether you should call a lawyer. That's why these rights become bad. That's something that they've never tackled on their side of the house. But here's the second
specific argument that in conspiracy cases, there's now a rush to confess because it takes time to get a lawyer is a new argument that's came on.
I'm sure. Sure, yeah, they think it's new because they ignored our second independent point, which they dropped, and I'll get to that soon when we talk about police being able to control the pace of situation. But the second question I want to ask is this a good police tool? And in weighing whether a police tool is good, we have to weigh the utility with the right. Now they say, look, there are checks against abuse, so you get more tools with none of the abuse. Here's the problem. The checks against abuse are the Miranda rights that we've already told you are basically worthless. So what are the only other checks? The kind of procedural checks we get in the court. The problem is, the thing that we're putting in court as evidence is not the fake DNA evidence we claim that we got, it's the confession that we coerced out. Confession that we went into their house and got. This is the evidence that we're going to be using, and they haven't told us a way that people would be able to actually discover that police used this tactic. But moreover, if they believe that this is something that on their side of the house they would allow, then they apparently think that this is actually okay to do. They never actually tell us something we should never say. But moreover, we think that there's no distinction between this and torture. So the first distinction they give is the distinction is torture hurts and leaves a mark. Like, we don't allow sleep deprivation. We don't allow police to give people sodium pentothal in interrogation. Because these are different psychological tortures that we don't allow. Similarly, we won't allow this. But the second thing that they give us in LOR, actually, is it's sometimes coercive to tell the truth and give threats. Like, that is due coercion. That's coercion as a result of information that people deserve to know in order to determine how they ought to act rationally. What we're talking about is putting undue coercion on top of deserve because it does not concern the actual relevant events in their life or in their trial. That is, we've made the argument throughout the entire round that people who are in interrogation situations deserve to have this degree of information, and that they deserve also not to have information that is not true. They've never really contested this basic fundamental philosophy. So the third and final question I want to ask is, what do we strive for in our legal system? And I think we give you two things. The first thing is protecting the innocent. They say innocent people will never be intimidated because they'll be like, look, if we go to trial, then there's no way that I'll ever, take a look at the guy who wasn't there, but we say there was DNA evidence. And they give us these really extreme examples. Like, the non-extreme examples are what we're going after here. Like, look, there was a shooting in this club, you were at this club, and somebody's going to testify against you. Well, even if the person didn't do it, they may be scared shitless that somebody's actually going to testify against them. Or that even if they weren't there and they believe it's really far-fetched that they'd be able to have this evidence, that there's still a possibility the court is going to make a bad decision and that they'll still go to jail. We would say that people are inherently risk-averse. That's why people are probably going to opt for plea bargains. Either go to jail or go free. They see the options being either go to jail for 50 years or go to jail for 5 years. Because the police have convinced them that there's a very very, very low possibility of them actually being able to not go to jail. That's why it's unduly coercive, because you're forcing them into a false binary that doesn't actually exist in reality. But the second thing that we talked about is more arrest of innocence. And basically after higher independent points, you can flow that right across. But the second thing that the last thing I want to talk about is fair balances. That is no countervailing power to lie, allowing the police to act rationally and slowly while forcing the accused to act emotionally and hastily and disproportionately targeting innocents. I did not hear direct refutations of this at all, which means that they haven't given us any standard as to what our court system is actually supposed to strive for in terms of it being an adversarial system. If they can't tell us why they preserve adversarial